Good morning and welcome to St Augustine's Church in Ramsgate for this series of talks that we are doing for Pugin Week. Because of circumstances beyond our control, which I'm sure you know about, we are unable to run Pugin Week as normal, inviting you to the church and to listen to these talks in person. And so we're doing the next best thing, and I'm Father Simon Heans. I'm the administrator of the Shrine of St Augustine and the National Pugin Centre. And since arriving in Ramsgate to do this job, of course, I've had to find out about Pugin, and a fascinating journey it's been for me. Pugin was a Catholic convert, as am I, and I am a member of the Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham, whose co-patron is John Henry Newman. So these two men are much in my mind, and I knew that they knew each other, and so for my talk I would like to go through their relationship from the beginning, when they met in Oxford, to the death of Pugin. I'm going to do so by reference to two unpublished Durham University theses, which were written under the supervision of Dr. Sheridan Gilly, the distinguished historian of the Victorian Church. These two theses are available as e-theses. In other words, they can be consulted online. And I'm very grateful to Durham University for making them available, and particularly, of course, grateful to their authors, Mr. Richard Prickett and Dr. Christabel Powell. The talk is entitled Pugin, Newman and the Meaning of Gothic. Why was Pugin so committed to Gothic art and architecture? And why was Newman ambivalent about it? In this short talk, I shall endeavour to answer these questions. Historians have generally taken two approaches to the task of explaining Pugin's commitment to Gothic. The first, which I call the aesthetic approach, is represented by Trappus Lomax's claim that Pugin, quote, set out on his tireless search for ancient beauty, and he found the road to Rome. As I shall argue, following the work of the two Durham University scholars I have just mentioned, this is almost the exact opposite of the truth. Pugin's quest was for religious, specifically liturgical truth. He did not search for ancient beauty because he was brought up with it. He already knew about it from his father. One of those Durham scholars I have mentioned, Richard Prickett, discusses the influence on Pugin of Augustus Charles's specimens of the Gothic architecture of Normandy of 1828, which he suggests inspired him to fill 8 pages of one of his sketchbooks with designs for a Catholic chapel, drawings which were preparation for, Prickett argues, the first edition of Contrasts, 1836. The tireless search on which Pugin embarked at the age of 19 was not for ancient beauty per se, but for its meaning, as Pugin himself reveals in the public journal quoted by Ferry in his Recollections. The origin, intention, and use of all that I beheld around me was then, before he understood the nature of the Catholic art the Catholic nature of the art around him, was perfectly unintelligible to me. But applying myself to liturgical knowledge, what a new field was opened up to me. The second approach to understanding the dedication that Pugin had for Gothic is perhaps best represented by Professor Michael Alexander in his brilliant study, Medievalism. Chapter 4 is devoted to Pugin and entitled Residences for the Poor. Of course, Alexander is being selective and focusing on one aspect of Pugin's work, indeed one particular text, namely contrasts, and he knows very well there is much more to Pugin's oeuvre. But it is nonetheless the case that the Pugin he presents is a political campaigner and social reformer. Therein, we are invited to believe, lies the reason for his commitment to the Gothic. Painting on a broader canvas, Professor Rosemary Hill's magisterial biography, God's Architect, despite its title, sees Pugin's allegiance to the Gothic as fundamentally social in inspiration. He pointed, she writes, to the Middle Ages as a model, not just for architecture, but for society, for a coherent Christian civic order in which the poor would be fed, the old cared for, the children taught. Certainly for Hill, Pugin's religion is important, but as here, she sees it more as a source of his social thought and action than as a subject in its own right. What might be called the religious lacuna in Hill's learned study is on display in this verdict on his conversion. Quote, "Of the interior and spiritual experience of these months, Pugin, who was not by nature introspective, said nothing. A view which I would suggest is powerfully rebutted by the researches of the two Durham scholars I have mentioned. For Pugin, conversion was a long process that took years, not months, and it is in this period of preparation that we find, quote, the interior and spiritual experience of this conversion recorded." I just want, on an almost autobiographical note, to refer to the book where I first discovered Pugin. It is the late David Watkins' Morality and Modern Architecture. Professor Watkin was a fellow of Peterhouse, Cambridge, where I was an undergraduate reading history. I did not switch to the history of art tripos, as some of my contemporary historians did. Many of them were attracted by Watkins' character and his academic prowess. But Watkin was a Catholic. I used to look out of my window on a Sunday morning and saw him putting on his bicycle clips to go to Mass. But for Watkin, Pugin is not a hero. Rather, in Morality and Modern Architecture, he sees Pugin as a proto-modernist, which of course he abominates. Watkin does this, I think, because he sees Pugin, like the modernists 100 years later, as forcing architecture into the straitjacket of a social and moral ideology, a program for the reconstruction of society. Well, perhaps this is a legitimate reading of contrasts, but it is certainly not true of his other writings. In short, it ignores what Dr. Powell calls his liturgical vision, which he sees as central to his work. This, I would suggest, following her, is the source of his social and indeed aesthetic vision. Watkin, in Morality and Modern Architecture, draws a line of descent from Contrasts of 1836 to Pevsner's Pioneers of the Modern Movement of 1936. Strange as it may seem, as a co-religionist of Pugin's, Watkin is not interested in Pugin's ecclesiastical art or his many writings explaining and defending it. I would say that contrast has become too prominent in the assessment of Pugin and his thought. Dr. Powell redresses the balance. Perhaps what we need to do is to read Pugin backwards from his great work, A Treatise on Chancel Screens, and then in his work that led up to that. And then we get a better sense of where Pugin's appreciation of the Gothic came from. It was the result of a liturgical vision. As I've said already that Dr. Powell is the scholar who exhaustively documents Pugin's liturgical vision. And she shows, to my satisfaction at least, that the desire to restore Catholic faith and worship in England was the raison d'etre of his dedication to Gothic. For Pugin, the meaning of Gothic was Catholic, and Catholic meant Gothic. That is why he was committed to it heart and soul. As she shows, this identification between Gothic and Catholic was made by Pugin during the extensive historical researches he conducted in cathedral libraries and through the examination of the cathedral buildings themselves. Pugin wrote about this period very movingly, in my opinion, in what is known as the public memoir that can be found in Benjamin Ferry's Recollections, already referred to. I gained my knowledge, he writes, for upwards of 3 years, from 1831 and 1832, did I earnestly pursue the study of this all-important subject. He is referring to the connection between Gothic architecture and Catholic faith and worship. And he writes, I'll just quote a few words from the public memoir. I can assure you, after a most useful and impartial investigation, I feel perfectly convinced that the Catholic Church is the only true one. I gained my knowledge of the ancient faith beneath the vaults of a Lincoln or a Westminster, and I found it indelibly marked in the venerable piles which cover the face of this land. The images of holy personages of every age and clime that shine in the painted windows or stand in the canopied niches and shrines, told of its Catholicity. He goes on, I found on many a sculptured font, and the vestments on the priestly effigies set forth the splendour of the ancient solemnity by the help of the histories of the devout and painful Dugdale. I replenished in imagination the empty sacristies of York and Lincoln with a costly array of precious vessels and reliquaries and richly embroidered images. And he also refers to the knowledge that he gained of the 7 sacraments of the church. The 7 sacraments of the church I found in many a sculptured font. This was a period of awakening, a time when Pugin enlightened himself as to the nature of Gothic. He discovered that it was Catholic, and through it he found the Catholic faith. Obviously, Pugin's reception into the Catholic Church owed nothing to the modern continental Catholicism with its roots in Rome and the papacy. His Catholicism, on the contrary, was national, English, and medieval. It was an English, or as the word was used a lot in the period of Pugin's life, an Anglo-Catholicism. And this was the same kind of Catholicism to which Newman was committed in his Anglican period. Many positive comments about Gothic can be found in his writings at this time, which is why Pugin saw him as an ally. At their first meeting just before the publication of Tract 90 in 1841, Newman told Pugin that he shared his dislike of neoclassical architecture. And in addition, Newman was a founder member of the Oxford Society for the Promotion of the Study of Gothic Architecture, began in 1839. The Tractarians, including Newman, supported Pugin over the rejection of Pugin's Gothic design for new buildings at Balliol. This shindy at Balliol, as was referred to by one of Newman's and Pugin's friends, Bloxham, lasted from 1843 to 1845. And Pugin collaborated with Newman in producing 11 plates for the Lives of English Saints, a book that Newman edited. Evidence of Pugin's belief that Newman was a supporter of the Gothic programme comes from the plans Pugin sent Newman for furnishing the chapel at Littlemore. He did so at Newman's request, whence Newman had retreated after the furore caused by the publication of Tract 90. There is no evidence that Newman actually used these plans, but he did not use them out of any aesthetic antipathy, because, as Prickett says, the chapel at Littlemore was in a plain Gothic style, and it was adorned by a number of high church ecclesiological features, such as altar lights and stained glass, introduced by his curate Bloxham, who was, of all the Oxford men, the closest also to Pugin. Even after his reception, we find Newman praising Pugin in extravagant terms. After visiting his reception, of course, into the Catholic Church in 1845. After visiting St. Giles's Cheadle just before it opened, he wrote to Elizabeth Bowden in June 1846, describing it as, quote, "the most splendid building I ever saw. The chapel of the Blessed Sacrament is a blaze of light and I could not help saying to myself, Porta Caeli, the gate of heaven. And the aesthetic appeal exerted by Gothic continued to captivate him well after his reception into the Catholic Church. If the view he expressed in an 1850 letter to a Miss Holmes, who incidentally was governess to Pugin's children at this time, an interesting fact given that Newman and Pugin were now in 1850 at odds with one another publicly, and their relationship had soured into an estrangement. Nevertheless, Newman was writing to Miss Holmes, and Pugin was employing her as a governess to his children. Newman wrote in 1850, Gothic is a far more beautiful idea in architecture than Grecian, far more fruitful, elastic, and ready. After the opening of St. Giles's, Newman began the journey to Rome, where he was to undertake studies in preparation for ordination as a Catholic priest. On the way, he stayed in Milan, from where he wrote 2 letters on the same day, the 24th of September, 1846, one to William Penny and another to Henry Wilberforce. In the first, after he rhapsodized about the, quote, sweet, smiling countenance of the Milanese Jesuit church, and the altar so gracious and winning, standing out for all to see and approach, he concludes, younger men may prefer Gothic if they will tolerate me in my weakness, which requires the Italian. Then to Wilberforce he confessed, however my reason may go with Gothic, my heart has gone with Grecian, explaining, I loved Trinity Chapel more than any other building, end of quote. These wistful sentiments could simply be dismissed as the musings of a man conscious that he is no longer young and has failed to keep pace with the march of mind. According to Hardman Powell, Pugin, and this is a quote, Pugin often declared that the test of a true Goth was to go to Rome and come back unchanged. It would seem that Newman failed that test as far north as Milan, and that despite the Gothic glories of Milan's cathedral. Pugin arrived in Rome during April 1847 and stayed for a month, during which he was received in audience by Pio Nono, Pius IX, together with 79 other English converts, many of them Oxford men, and of course including Newman himself. During this ceremony, Pugin was presented with a gold medal for architecture by the Pope. And in the course of his stay in Rome, Pugin spent time with Newman. They visited Overbeck and the Nazarene community of German Gothic Catholic artists together. They were also at St. Peter's in each other's company, where Pugin horrified Newman by his denunciation of it as, quote, pagan. Nevertheless, Newman reached out to Pugin and encouraged him to visit Chiesa Nuova, which he thought might cause him to question his Gothic prejudices, as Newman saw them. But Pugin refused to go. Despite becoming uncomfortably aware that Pugin's polemical and exclusivist views on architecture were a million miles away from his own, as he saw them moderate and inclusive ones, Newman confided in him that he intended to become an Oratorian and asked if he, Pugin, would consider designing an oratory for his intended community. Pugin's reply that he would rather design a mechanics institute marked the end of their amicable relationship, according to Professor Hill. She writes, from now on, he began to dislike Pugin and to undermine him when he could. Newman returned to England at the end of 1847 as a Catholic priest and Oratorian. In February 1848, his conversion novel Loss and Gain was published, in which the following exchange occurs. "And which are you for, Gothic or Rome?" To which the answer is given, "For both in their place." Certainly Newman's conduct thereafter shows he was determined to put Gothic in its place by throwing his weight onto the Roman side of the debate. The side Newman was on becomes apparent when he wrote supporting Mrs. Bowden over her refusal to have a screen erected in the church she was financing and Pugin was building in Fulham. He preached at its opening, from which Pugin stayed away in disgust. Meanwhile, in the same month of May, Pugin discovered that the screen at St. Wilfrid's Cotton had been pulled down by Faber and what Dr. Powell calls Italian decorations introduced instead. Pugin's friend and fellow Goth, Ambrose Phillips de Lisle, wrote to Newman to protest at Faber's behaviour, not least the hostility Faber had displayed to Pugin and himself in the course of their visit. Faber also wrote to Newman, claiming that Phillips had, quote, "cursed the oratory." In reply, Newman wrote a letter which apparently urges tolerance and a live and let live attitude. He quotes the Latin tag, "in necessariis unitas, in dubias libertas." In other words, unity in essentials, but in what is debatable, freedom. Nevertheless, in the next paragraph, Newman nails his colours firmly to the mast, asking rhetorically, "Are there not persons who would be more distressed at a man disliking a chancel screen than at his being a Gallican?" That, of course, was a reference to Pugin. Gallicanism was a movement within the Catholic Church that rejected papal authority. Newman is suggesting that Pugin was a Gallican. And he ends the letter by issuing what can only be called a threat. Quote, "He, Pugin, will not be put down without authority which is infallible. And if we go to authority, I suppose popes have given a greater sanction to Italian than to Gothic." It is clear that he placed this aesthetic issue now among the essentials of faith rather than the points on which Catholics may legitimately differ. There is considerable irony in Newman's position here, bearing in mind that Newman agonized about the doctrine of papal infallibility when it was defined at the Vatican Council just over 20 years later. The enthusiastic convert clearly believed that it was right to invoke over the installation of a chancel screen in Staffordshire, that it was right to invoke it, the papal doctrine of papal infallibility, over the installation of a chancel screen in Staffordshire. But as the reference to Gallicanism suggests, there was more to this argument than met the eye of the visitor to St. Wilfrid's Church, Cotton Hall. What was at stake for Newman was nothing less than the future identity of the Catholic Church in England. Would she be truly Catholic, i.e. Roman Catholic, or would the English schism begun at the Reformation continue in the Catholic community? Gothic architecture was a Trojan horse for Anglicanism, a Catholicism in the English mould, believed Newman, rather like the one he had accepted when ministering at Oxford within the established church. That English Catholicism was the ghost that haunted Newman's mind, and its name became associated with Pugin. He was determined to free himself and the church to which he now belonged from it. The argument I'm making here that Newman's opposition to Gothic was ecclesiological in origin was first put forward by Bernard Ward, quote, "The English Catholics," he writes in the sequel to Catholic Emancipation, quote, "were not Roman enough for them," namely the Oratorians and their allies. They attributed, quote, "the misfortunes of the Reformation to the national spirit in the English church, and looked on the national architecture, rood screens, painted windows, pointed arches and the like, as positively suggestive of theological error." Ward also dismisses Newman's pose as the honest broker, mediating between the two factions, as false, claiming that, although he professed to be impartial on the matter, he became practically an anti-Goth. Newman's protest that we are against Philip's Delisle in that letter I've already quoted from, that we are preaching a crusade against you, or are throwing in what weight, as you kindly say, we have against Mr. Pugin, sounds rather hollow in view of his decision to refer Pugin to the College of Propaganda later in that same year. As he explained to R.A. Coffin, quote, "A so-called Englishman," a reference to Pugin's French ancestry, of course, "may speciously conceal under screens and roods a great deal of doctrinal error." Carrying out the threat he had made in that letter to Philip Delisle, he wrote in Latin to Monsignor Palmer, the secretary to Propaganda, on the 10th of November 1848. Dr. Powell has had it translated and quotes the last paragraph in her thesis. And therefore I would confirm, while the Gothicism has outwardly had favourable results in winning over the minds of Protestants, it is not an advantage to someone who has become a Catholic of his own accord, because it may cause England and its antiquities to be preferred to the seat of Peter. The most famous Catholic amongst us, who is not an ecclesiastic, Pugin, would not deny that this was so, and it will be remembered that when he was at the Vatican Temple recently, unmindful of the portals of the apostles, burst out that the Holy Temple was pagan, even calling it by that name, no doubt because it was in the classical style. Moreover, he added in an absolutely frenzied manner, if only that cupola would disintegrate and collapse. That submission, perhaps we might say, amounts to a crusade. After all, crusades were called on the authority of the Pope, and here is Newman invoking that same authority against Pugin. In this text, we see Newman employing three arguments. First, he claims that what he calls Gothicism is likely to lead the English Catholic Church into schism with Rome. The second is the way that Newman personalizes the issue, attributing to Pugin himself the responsibility for the dreaded Gothicism. The third is the claim that strongly expressed aesthetic opinions amount to heresy, and for that reason Pugin is a heretic. The anecdote with which the text ends about Pugin at St. Peter's is clearly intended to shock Monsignor Palmer. But as Rosemary Hill records, this verdict of Pugin on St. Peter's was overheard by two Catholic priests who actually nodded in agreement when he said that St. Peter's should be pulled down and rebuilt in the Gothic style. Here we see perhaps a conflict of temperament. Newman, serious, maybe even priggish. Pugin, exuberant, perhaps over-exuberant. As Dr. Powell records, the attempted indictment of Pugin was a fiasco. Monsignor Palmer was assassinated by Republicans a week after the letter was sent, and almost certainly did not read it. Pius IX's exile from Rome did not end until April 1850, and when the reply to Newman came, it was in the form of a reprimand for not going through the proper channels. Writing to Faber on November the 25th, 1849, Newman drew the conclusion that we shall, quote, we shall get nothing more from Rome now, end quote, which was rather different from the confident assumption he communicated to Coffin a year before in the letter I've already quoted from. Quote, I know I have at present the Pope's ear, end quote. Dr. Powell gives a full account of how the Tractarian converts turned against Pugin after becoming Roman Catholics. Since this paper is concerned with Newman's relationship with Pugin, I shall not prolong it by discussing in detail the propaganda campaign against the Gothic conducted by Faber. See especially his book, The Spirit and Genius of St. Philip Neri, founder of the Oratory, 1850, of which, according to Dr. Powell, quote, more than half was devoted to an attack on Pugin's views on liturgy. Nor will I deal at length with Ward, whose attacks on Pugin began soon after his conversion in 1845, following on Ward's rejection of Pugin's Gothic design for his house at St. Edmund's College, Ware. Faber took legal action against Pugin's patron, the Earl of Shrewsbury, for the recovery of £3,000. Faber claimed his community had spent on improvements to St. Wilfrid's Church, which had been given to them by the Earl. Newman's involvement in the case caused a bitter outburst from Pugin against Newman in a letter to Bloxham. But what can you expect from a man who went to law to recover a gift offered to the Church? Neither do I intend to discuss in detail the content of the articles critical of Pugin published in the Rambler from 1848 to 1851, while under the editorship of another Oxford man, J.M. Capes, because Newman insisted that that periodical did not speak for him or the Oratorians, as was commonly believed. Quote, for myself, he wrote to Miss Wilson, no one here, meaning presumably at the Birmingham Oratory, has ever written one line of discussion, criticism, or correspondence in the Rambler, end quote. However, Powell points out that its editor, Capes, quote, frequently referred to Newman for his approval, opinion, and advice about articles, and cites in evidence letters written to each other about issues of the day, collected in the Desain volumes, letters, and live diaries. To try to put pay to the rumours that Capes was the oracle of the Oratorians, as it were, Newman persuaded Capes to put a disclaimer in the May 1851 edition, to the effect that the magazine had no association with the Oratorians. This was carefully drafted by Newman himself, which again points to the contrary being true of his relationship with the magazine, the Rambler, than the one that he wished to give, the impression that he wished to give. At the same time, Newman was writing to Bishop Ullathorne, denying any connection with, quotes, the screen controversy, claiming that, quote, the members of the oratory really have nothing to do with it, end quote. Newman was working the bishops in the hope that they would intervene and slap Pugin down, which is exactly what Wiseman did in his sermon for the feast of St. Philip Neri in 1851. The emphasis of the sermon was on the necessity of building churches which are adapted to modern, continental liturgical practice. Quote, all things must give way, said Wiseman, to the exigencies of the rubrics of the church and to the spirit of modern devotions. The sermon perhaps could have been written by Newman himself. Well, Rome had spoken, and thus ended the mid-19th century liturgy wars. Certainly, Dr. Powell is right to see the conflict between Newman and Pugin in liturgical terms. But I have suggested in this paper that it went even deeper. It was ecclesiological, not only liturgical. For Pugin, Gothic meant Catholic, and Catholic meant Gothic. As long as Newman, Faber and the other Oxford men were in the Church of England, they were happy to accept Pugin's claim that they really were the same thing, viz. That Gothic was the phenomenon or appearance to the essence which was Catholic faith and worship. Or to put it in theological terms rather than Hegelian ones, that Gothic architecture was sacramental, an outward and visible sign of an inward and invisible grace. That is certainly how Pugin experienced Gothic architecture. Looking at the great cathedrals in England and northern France, then reading about how they were used, made him a Catholic. But Newman became a Catholic through books rather than buildings. As long as he remained in the Church of England, then the Gothic he was prepared to accept was Catholic. But once he had left, it became almost synonymous in his mind with anti-Catholic. It represented what the Oxford converts called Puseyism, the attempt to Catholicize the Church of England rather than leaving the national establishment, as Newman called it in his 1850 lectures on certain difficulties felt by Anglicans in submitting to the Catholic Church. The irony is that Pugin held exactly the same position. Would anyone, he asked in a letter to Wiseman in answer to complaints received by Wiseman over his earnest address on the establishment of the hierarchy, published in 1851, would anyone suggest, would anyone dare to affirm that I defend anyone convinced of Catholic truth remaining separated 1 hour from unity, or the obedience of those pastors holding jurisdiction from the Holy See? The staunchness of Pugin's loyalty to the Holy See is stated in the review that Purcell wrote of Benjamin Ferry's recollections. Purcell wrote that Pugin proved to be, quote, an ultramontane, that is, as obedient a son of the Pope as those from whom he so widely differed. And he, of course, is referring to Newman and the Oratorians. The earnest address of 1851 was reissued by his son in 1875 at the height of the controversy over the Vatican decree on papal infallibility. And here is a copy of that 1875 edition of the work. Interestingly, Newman, during this very controversy, had to defend himself, just like Pugin, of disloyalty to the church. And as Pugin did, scotch rumours that he was thinking of returning to Anglicanism. Newman wrote, "Be sure there is as much chance of me turning Anglican again as of my being the king of clubs." Newman also wrote a letter accepting with gratitude the gift of the reissue of Pugin's earnest address. And Newman's reply to Edward Pugin is stapled or stuck into this edition of the earnest address. This is the facsimile of the very letter that Newman wrote from the oratory on February the 10th, 1875. Newman thanked Edward for his gift and called the book an exposition of great and most important principles, adding that he was pleased to see that Pugin had used the term breakwater before he, Newman, did to describe the Church of England's relationship to the Catholic Church. Just 2 years before he wrote, and just 2 years before he had written the following about Gothic architecture in The Idea of a University, published 1873. For myself, certainly, I think that the style of which, whatever be its origin, is called Gothic, is endowed with a profound and a commanding beauty, such as no other style possesses, with which we are acquainted, and which probably the Church will not see surpassed till it attain to the celestial city. Gothic evidently no longer meant Anglicanism to Newman, and so at last he could be reconciled, albeit posthumously, with his fellow convert and his brother in the faith, Augustus Pugin. As a postscript to this talk, I'd just like to mention that we have a relic of John Henry Newman. It's a primary relic, a lock of his hair, which was cut when he was first tonsured in 1845. We have been thinking about making a reliquary for this relic, and we have had a design submitted to us by the same artist who created the reliquary for the three saints associated with Augustine. Associated with Augustine's mission, Augustine himself, Gregory and Lawrence. And so we end on that ironic note, a note of reconciliation between these two great Catholic figures of the 19th century. And perhaps it would be fitting that we did get this reliquary made and installed it opposite the Pugin chantry. Thank you for listening.